Mike Laidlaw, welcome to the Game Informer Show, sir.
Hey, thanks for having me.
It's an honor to have you. I think everyone's wondering, what is your life like these days? You have a wonderful set behind you with hats and a green screen. Is this just Mike's life from here on out?
Yeah, it's okay. So I mean, the hats and green screen are all Twitch accessories these days. I decided one of the things I really wanted to do was dig into it. I've been doing it, God, maybe 2 years now. And it's really fun to just kind of use it as an excuse to play games and stuff. And I've got this little tradition on Saturday nights. I will grab something small from like an indie studio and like stream their stuff for like 2 hours that I've never played before. So it means I'm kind of at least getting through the backlog of shame in terms of I've launched the games in my giant Steam pile. But yeah, what I'm up to, I would say more formally, is I've been kind of trying my hat at consulting. And so there's been cool opportunities to work with other studios. And one of the big things I wanted to do is just take the advantage to shake up that I'm not at the same place for, a decade plus, and see what other kind of methodologies are out there, what other teams are doing, and that kind of stuff. Obviously, I can't talk about what I've been consulting on, but for thus far, I've worked with 4 different groups, and it's been a blast. Yeah,
I mean, without getting specifics of the games you're actually consulting on, like, what's the big takeaway? How eye-opening has it been? What have been some of the biggest shocks of like, oh, this is how other studios work? I was so inside this bubble, I had no idea.
I honestly, nothing shocked me. Nothing's been like, wow, I had no idea it would be like this. What's been interesting is how much common kind of methodology and approach has evolved almost in parallel. So if I'm at a big studio, I tend to see a lot of things are very, very familiar to stuff we talked about at EA or stuff we talked about at BioWare, but it will have different names. It will have a slightly different cast on it. But there's also a bunch of stuff like Scrum methodology or Kanban that are kind of more, development directory production stuff that has been adopted almost across the industry. So you kind of get a really interesting sense of how it's like, it's like from Spanish to Galician to Portuguese, and how they're all clearly in the same family, but they are kind of steps along a path, and that they've evolved in some degree of parallel. It's really been quite cool to see.
Yeah. Are you focusing mainly on narrative then, or are you just overall, hey, here's tips on just overall directing a game as well?
I would say it's been a mix. It depends on what the studio needs. For the most part, I've been definitely there's been a heavy narrative component, because I think that's where there isn't necessarily the same level of expertise of storyteller, but who has been in like kind of large team management. And that's, I think, kind of the special thing they're looking for is they like, if I'm working with say it's a mobile studio, they know exactly how to build really compelling mobile games, but they may not know how to get story into them, but still have it be very gameplay centric. So that's the stuff that's been a lot of the questions, and that's been pretty cool.
How long were you at BioWare? What year did you start?
2003. So I started when Jade Empire was spinning back up after Neverwinter Nights completed. So 14 years.
So when you're doing this consulting, are you, no offense, Mike, but are you working predominantly with younger developers in general? Like, do they want stories of the olden days of what it was like in the mid-aughts at BioWare?
Okay. So it's funny. I do. I would not say I'm working with super young teams. There's been one group that's been fairly junior, but what you'll have is the range, right? So the people that often it's people I know across the industry I've worked with, they were formerly at EA or some other role, who are the ones bringing me in, but there's always junior members of any team. And yeah, there is a little bit of like, tell us, Uncle Mike, tell us what it was like in the before times.
So it's the story of the shepherd. Yeah.
Yeah. The big ones that resonate are when I talk about, so I used to write for the Adrenaline Vault, which was like a website that did game reviews way back. And it was one that was like, I think a lot of its traffic was driven by having like just a massive patch library, but I used to review them. And, in 2001, I got to watch the bottom fall of the internet because no one would ever actually make any money from advertisements or internet at all. And kind of watching that evolve over the years has been highly entertaining to me. So
does it feel like you're going full circle and going back to that era? Like talking about these games, playing them on Twitch, do you feel like, oh, I'm almost reviewing games again?
Like a little bit. It's so different though, because, back then was very much the get the game in the mail, write about it for like a week or two and then get, 1,500 words or 2,000 words up, but just like paragraph form, proper, scoring by style and stuff.
Yeah.
These days it's more figure it out as I go, play it live, interact with audience, right? All that stuff is completely different, but it has a bit of the same feel, but at the same time, it's funny when you have like, a Twitch community that develops their own internal jokes. Like if I can name a character, they're getting named Kevin because of a RimWorld character who actually survived a hellish campaign, but finally made it back to space with a prosthetic arm as he so deeply desired.
Is it satisfying to feel like the stress is just flowing out of your body at this point? It's just night and day compared to just being in the grind of a studio like BioWare?
Well, here's the thing. BioWare was not typically a grind in that, like, there was this kind of crushing mandate or anything like that. There was certainly very much the day to day, and that's the big change. Is now there's a lot more kind of shorter but fresh challenge. And I think the thing that I found is really different is my job with Dragon Age was for, say, the better part of a decade to care about one thing exceptionally deeply. And with consulting, your job is to dive into something new, acclimate, and you need to care, because you can't. I don't think you can make any kind of creative product without that level of passion. But you can't and don't need to maintain that for like year-long horizons. You need to be thinking that far out, but it's not necessarily on you to execute across that period of time. Mm-hmm. And it creates a very different kind of approach where my job is to try and say, well, in my experience, this kind of thing will be dangerous if you don't anticipate these problems, or if you aren't looking at this kind of scope or having a crumple plan for your development.
Hang on, stop. I got to get a definition. Crumple plan?
Sorry, crumple plan is a term I used to use with the team where what if we hit a brick wall? What do we do to survive that? As in the same way that a car is built with specific zones that are like, if this collapses, it won't harm the passengers. So they build crumple zones into their plans. And so with the team, I would often like sit down with the writers or like the level designers and say, okay, if we had to cut like a quarter of this because of some sort of timeline thing or a staffing problem where we couldn't get expertise or the programmers couldn't optimize conversations or something, what would we do? Right? What would you do if things got disastrous? And then that's where you say, well, what if we hit a wall? How would we crumple in such a way that we survive?
So then, okay, I'm very interested in the nitty gritty of this whole thing. So then do you have just like a Google Doc somewhere with like, okay, we have the plan for, if D scenario happens, let's go ahead, pull the parachute, let's go to D scenario, because we've worked out every hypothetical. But then at the same time, if you're going around early in a project to each department and saying, okay, what if your life was just lit on fire? What would you do? How does that not freak everybody out?
Well, I think what I've found is that a dev who's fairly junior will tend to get really weirded out by that. A dev who's fairly senior will get weirded out by that not being discussed. Interesting. Right? Because things go wrong. I've often joked that the fine art of video games, even more so than movies, is that we need to spin an entire reality and systems by which that reality interacts using the gossamer thread of nothing, right? We don't get an actor who looks a certain way, acts a certain way, and is attended to school. We get a voice actor, but like their appearance, their character, we may be face scanning, but we still have to do all of that work. There's all that kind of extra stuff. I used to joke that, in movies, this is free, right? Just cloth moving is a free thing for them. But for us, weirdly, flying is free, right? Make a character just go up in the air and ignore gravity. That's super free. So it's like a different skill set.
Yeah.
But more veteran devs know that something will always go wrong. And if you build your plan and build your content kind of so that you are right up to the line where it's like, well, we have 100 people and we have 10 days, so we have 1,000 staff days, so we're just going to get this done. That assumes no one ever gets sick, no one has a personal crisis, no one ever has a bad day, right. Like that everything is optimal and there's never a power outage. And over the years, you learn that something will always go wrong. So the end of Jade Empire, for instance, our entire building got shut down because there was a flood in the basement that destroyed the transformer that powered everything for the building we just moved into.
Oh my God.
And the IT team, and I remember Mark Dara was lead programmer at Jade at the time, and he was instrumental in this. We basically took all the most important people, airlifted them to the hotel next door, rented a ballroom, and ran 1,000 extension cords, and then sent everyone else home because the rest of the building was basically out for 2 weeks. And that's in the hardcore cert submission. This is going to Microsoft for finaling. Like we had to get it moving. So you have to anticipate that, but you lose days of work times hundreds of people. That's a year gone with each day. If you have 300 people on your staff,
right.
You have to anticipate that. So you walk around and you basically say, if things did go wrong, what would we do? And I think in a lot of ways, it's It's a question you have to ask yourself to say, assuming something will go wrong, we don't know what. Do we have we built a thing that could withstand a change, right? And if you end up with a story or a set of levels that like this whole game doesn't make sense unless 100% of this is here, then you've built a very brittle structure, and that's the thing that will not survive contact with reality, as I put it. So we tend to look for having flex, having room, and then having a plan to crumple if need be.
Yeah. So I mean, having to shift over to the hotel, was that the biggest disaster or the biggest crumple you had to deal with throughout your years?
I would say there was a secondary one that was it was mitigated, thankfully, but there was a team meeting where I'm trying to remember. I think it was either early days Inquisition or late DA2. I think it was late DA2, and we were doing like a sprint planning. So all the leads, the whole leadership group would go. And again, we rented a ballroom because we had a meeting room that was big enough, but it was nice because you could go up and get buffet. And it was kind of like an all day event where you were planning, what hundreds of people would be doing for months. And I guess someone sneezed on the ham because like 35 of us got norovirus, like the full on, like hold a bucket so you can puke while you're sitting on the can kind of norovirus. And I remember so clearly our lead programmer, Jacques Lebrun, going, "Hey guys, do you feel a little off? I feel kind of sick. Like I'm getting the flu." And I'm like, "No, I feel fine." And then 3 hours later, I'm sitting there with a glass of red wine going, I don't feel so good either. And then I was off wine for about a year as a direct result of how terrible that was. But so that happened. And like, sidelined us to a serious degree. I think actually it might have been DA2 DLC or something. Anyway, it doesn't matter. What matters is that we were also like nearing the end of working on like Mass Effect 2. So that whole team was like, oh God, no Dragon Age people are allowed on the floor. Like they went into this kind of soft quarantine to make sure that they didn't all come down with norovirus. Because, it is pretty contagious.
Yeah.
Not airborne, but anything droplet related. So yeah, we got leveled, and that was an unpleasant series of events, let me tell you.
Jeez. So, yeah. I mean, you talked about, how you want to see what else is out there, see what the rest of the industry is up to and whatnot, but that's the main reason you left? I mean, we hear reports of like, oh, Dragon Age, it's moving into the future in some vague sense, and it's maybe been rebooted recently or gone through some changes. Was that a result of you leaving, or were the changes made and then it's like, I'm going to go ahead and head out?
Yeah, it's probably, I mean, to some degree, a creative director leaving is always going to result in changes, right? Yeah. Because someone's going to have to take those reins, and typically people have different visions for games. So you hear those reports, I wouldn't be surprised. What did happen is that there was kind of a scenario where, like, we were working on something related to DA, right. And there was kind of a confluence of events where a bunch of people were moving on to Anthem, which is, again, pretty common and pretty standard operational procedure. Because when you're working on a game of that size, you tend to want to do it. I mean, people from Andromeda moved to help us for Inquisition and so on. So it ended up in a place where there was kind of like, how did I even describe it? It's like a production lull, where like there's a moment where it's kind of calm and it's not super pressing, and there's not like 100 people looking to you for direction and guidance. And I was at the point where, I joke that 14 years is like the 7-year itch times 2, right? Your second round of it, like the foot fungus coming back or something. And it was a point where, like, I was kind of, I'd been talking to Mark about, like, I'm not sure this might be my last one. I kind of feel like I want to do some other stuff. The Twitch thing, I wouldn't say it's like taking off in that I have 1 billion followers, but it's like, I kind of wanted to explore that.
Interesting.
I was thinking about consulting. So it was at a point where I was able to do it without being highly disruptive to my team.
Yeah.
Right. I was able to move on where they could, still, comfortably have jobs and clear tasks ahead of them and that kind of stuff. And to me, that's pretty important, because I always looked at my team as being like, my job is to make not just the designers, but the whole team, like the whole Dragon Age group, feel like they're a functioning family unit. And of course, if you just remove yourself from that when things are fairly tense, that's highly disruptive and frankly unfair. So when I had been thinking about it for a while, I spotted a lull. You put all those together, I'm like, I think this is the time. And it was scary and hard. And I super burst into tears while I was giving my goodbye speech because it was really emotional, and a whole bunch of people came. There was a lot of hugs, let's put it that way. And then my team kind of threw me awake. they went down to the bar and they started just busting out liquor, and we had a really good chat, and I told a lot of war stories. It was a lot of fun. And more of the happy ones, like less the yay, we blew up the transformer. We didn't, but more like, hey, this one time this person came up to me at PAX and gave me a giant hug because they felt they've been represented in the game for the first time, and that kind of stuff. That's like feel good, because if I could leave them with anything, it'd be an understanding that the work we did mattered, and it was important that we kept doing it.
Yeah, I mean, how does it feel to? You can only do so much as you're walking out the door of you're setting up the Tetris pieces, but it's still on the top of the screen and saying like, all right, I love you. I love the team. I think things are looking okay. And now I just have to separate myself. Has that been a tougher transition than you expected to kind of stop thinking about Dragon Age?
I think, if we get to the point where another one gets announced, that's going to be like a rough day. It's going to feel super weird. Like I won't be upset. But it'll feel strange.
It's complicated.
Right? Why isn't that me? I remember, I went on a giant weight loss kick last year, and I dropped about 80 pounds. And a big part of my motivation was like, let's go on stage and announce Dragon Age, being all slick and stuff. And thankfully, I've not suddenly put all the weight back on. Thankfully. I was actually worried about that. I'm like, oh wait, without this visualized goal. But for the most part, here's the thing. There's a really, really competent team of people that know, not like, I don't want to say that the direction it was headed, because that implies that it can only go one way. Dragon Age was always conceived to be a world that was run like a really good DM's campaign, at least we hope, a really good DM's campaign of like D&D and stuff, where there were plot threads waiting to be unraveled, and we had loosely a 2+ game plan, like where could it go from here?
Yeah.
Is that coherent? Is that sane? Yes, it is. Okay. And the team's at the point where like someone like Patrick Weeks, being a super veteran and possibly one of the best writers I've ever met. And I worked with like Drew and Dave, like other exceptional people, but like Patrick had a really good knack of tying it to gameplay and stuff too. And Daniel Kading, who he was with Relic for like over a decade, and then came to join us as lead design. Like the guy's absolutely brilliant. Like there are some incredibly talented designers who have been with the franchise more than long enough to have the DNA kind of right in their veins. And I think what they're going to do will probably be different than what I would necessarily do, but it'll be really interesting and really cool. So that helps me sleep at night.
Yeah, and you must have had a bizarre, unique perspective there, because Casey Hudson, creative director for Mass Effect, left, but then returned to BioWare. So in theory, as you're heading out the door, did you pull him aside and be like, hey, what does it feel like to walk out the doors of BioWare, Mr. Hudson?
There was a moment where we had a good long talk, and he said, no, I get it. I was exactly where you are right now in terms of needing a change and wanting to do something different. So I totally understand. And it was good. He was super understanding about it. And, Mark was a little more like, don't go, dude. But like Mark got it too. We'd worked together since the beginning.
Yeah. He's the executive producer of Dragon Age, right?
Yes. Executive producer of Dragon Age. Sorry. And, he was lead programmer on Jade Empire. So I knew him from way back.
Yeah.
Funny aside, apparently one of our first interactions, I complained that all the coffees that he and our producer at the time had gotten for the team were all like double cream, double sugar. And I'm like, dude, this is way too sweet. And he was like, how dare you turn up your nose at the free coffee we went and got you. And in retrospect, yeah, I was being a bit of a snot, but it was a tense time. He's never forgiven me, for the record. We worked together successfully for like 12 years, but he's never forgiven me for that moment.
Still brings it up. Bodily based conversation that I was expecting for the inner workings of BioWare. It's mostly about food and puking and pooping. Okay, got it.
I know. Just too much sugar in that coffee. Yeah. So anyway, it was a really good chat, and I did joke to the team. There was a moment where I said, hey, you never know. Maybe I'll head out, go work for Microsoft for 5 years, then come back and be in charge of the whole studio. Who knows? But it's not outside the realm of possibility, right?
Yeah.
It has happened, but yeah, no, it was cool. Casey was really good about it, and I think he kind of gave me these long, slow nods and went, "Yep, get it, understand."
Yeah, for sure. Can you share any insight into what that was like for the studio when Casey Hudson came back?
I think it was like, it was very much a surprise. No one knew he was coming back. So it was sort of like a team meeting where, Aaron announced he was heading out, and then Casey just sort of came around the corner. And,
oh, wow.
BioWare does not have a huge turnover, so a very, very significant portion of the studio had worked either directly with him or adjacent to his team. So we all instantly knew who he was, and it was like, well, I know my reaction was very much like, well, if you had to pick someone who at least understands the workings and the culture and stuff like that, it's a pretty good call. And Casey generally was well respected around the teams. He was exceptionally good at articulating like a vision with clarity, and that I think for like a studio lead is an exceptionally good talent to have. And what I found is that coming back from Microsoft, I wouldn't say he was different, but he certainly had like kind of a broader perspective around kind of leadership, and having worked in a company that was even larger. He remained intrigued by some of the stuff he'd worked on. I know he was still quite interested in some of like the AR, VR, so he was following it quite closely.
Yeah.
Not that he was going to push it, but that he talked about it with a level of I guess, intimacy that you would expect. But at the same time, it's really cool to hear someone kind of who went deep into something like that.
Yeah, it's interesting transition to say that he had focus and leadership. And I mean, that comes to the Mass Effect series and everything else that he worked on. But then the idea of, in his shoes, like broadening it out to entire studio. Like, how do we focus an entire studio? I guess it helps if the studio is so focused on Anthem,
Yeah, exactly. And I think, the two teams had different cultures, and there were times there were like up to 5 teams, but for the most part, if you say like the DA team and the Mass team, they had different DNA and they had slightly different approaches to things. But in terms of like, we're trying to tell a story, it's going to be kind of third-person action adventure. We're going to have characters you care about. Like, all of that was fairly well shared, and most of the teams would kind of fluidly move between whatever project was coming up to be the big one. So it wasn't like there was a massive drift. The leadership philosophy, I would say, was similar, while the approaches were different, right? Which I think most teams were more than comfortable with. And you found leads groups that had worked together for a fair amount of time and were able to kind of swiftly and quickly articulate to find solutions rather than just keep, talking around problems over and over. Both teams are very good at that. So
yeah. Well, you're giving a GDC speech coming up very soon. Have you been in a reflective mood trying to put that together? What has that been like?
It's been really interesting. Because I'm trying to find kind of anecdotes and lessons learned from kind of 14 years. Jokingly calling it empires to ages, right? Because that's the flow. But it is for the Narrative Summit specifically. They asked me to come talk, so I am putting more of a writerly cast on it. And what I'm really enjoying is I'm starting with stuff that's like, when I was a junior, I learned a valuable lesson, and working up to as a creative director, kind of at the other end of the writing spectrum. Yeah. There were other things. So it kind of, starts with a little more tactical and a little more like, hey, you might be a junior yourself. Here's some tips I use. Here's how I got through writer's block and that kind of stuff. And then working forward to when I was managing a team, or when I had to represent the team, like the writing team or that kind of stuff. Here were some things I did to help people who maybe, had a different focus, understand the priorities and the needs and so on. So it's deeply introspective. I will say it's not a bad mix when you're thinking about kind of, consulting, and it's like, well, I'm trying to take these life lessons and bring them forward to other teams. So how do I articulate them? So I'm finding it to be a very good exercise. Yeah. Do you have I also, it's worth noting, I recently joined the a Q&A panel called It's Not in the Writer's Manual. That's at like 12:30 on the Tuesday. Okay. And that's with a group of other writers at varying levels who are going to talk to more like junior writers or aspiring writers. So pretty excited to be involved in that too. Yeah, definitely. I mean, do you have a thesis from your 14 years? Like, I don't want to spoil your punchline, Mike, but if there's something at the end where it's like, overall, this is the biggest lesson, this is my North Star. Do you have any go-to point there? I think so. I think probably for me, the two biggest things that where I enjoyed the most success is when I had and articulated a clear vision and put the effort into going through the very painful process of tumbling the rock of an idea into the gemstone of something that's actually like an articulable vision that a team can kind of get behind. And that's not something you can ever do by yourself. You have to do it with your fellow leads. You have to do it with usually with the team that's starting. And then the transparency side of it is recognizing and respecting that the team you work with are exceptionally smart. They're very talented. They could work anywhere in the industry. And they need to know that the decisions you're making are for good reason and that you've done your due diligence in making them, right? So you aren't just randomly changing your mind. You didn't just play Horizon Zero Dawn and now it's all robot dinosaurs, right? Like you need to have a reason for why you're doing it, and that the more transparent you can be and the more open and honest you can be with your team, the better they will respond to change and uncertainty, because they will trust that you will keep them in the loop and keep them aware of what's happening.
Does that just mean more team meetings? Does that mean having bullet points that are posted on the wall? What does that mean?
Every communication strategy you could possibly employ. I don't think I've ever had a manager feedback where people were like, Mike's communicating way too much about what's happening with my career. That's never, ever happened. And I think that for me, it's overall, we had a team value on Dragon Age that basically was that we would speak with candor but without rancor, right? Not the big rancor, but like that we wouldn't be full of heat or hate or anything, but that we would be candid in our feedback. And a big part of that as well was taking our notes from, again, Mark, who was the EP, and Mark led the Dragon Age team in a very matter of fact way. To the point where you almost were afraid to ask him questions because he'd tell you the answer, and sometimes you weren't ready for the answer. But still, there was a level of respect that he commanded, and that I think the leads team took from him and from AQ to say, we don't need to dance around tough issues. And over the years, I got better and better at being direct with my team and occasionally saying, yes, this does suck, but you know what? We have a strategy for dealing with it. We've thought about it. Here's what we're going to be doing. And if any of you want to talk about it, my room is right over there. Grab me. We'll break out. We'll do a session and we'll go get coffee, whatever you need. And I find that the more consistent and the more open you are about that, the more they'll believe you and the more that a team will come to trust that there is good decisions being made. Because you're showing your math.
Right, exactly. I mean, where does the temptation or the urge to tap dance around issues come from? Is it just, it'd be uncomfortable? Or is it just, hey, it's backfired a number of times where we've been open and honest, and then somebody on the team says, F that, this is effed?
I think both of those, natural human kind of aversion to conflict, right? Some people like really get off on conflict, and I find they tend to be very bad team players because they make it, right? They generate conflict, or they deliberately say antagonistic things. I'm an only child, so I have a lot of like, oh God, I can't upset people kind of weird hangups that I'm mostly through nowadays. I try to be functional for an only child. But and I'm Canadian, so like it's surprising I wouldn't say shit if I had some in my mouth, right? But for the most part, I think it's a learned skill to be able to figure out how to deploy bad news in a way that isn't hopeless, right? In a way that gives people a real understanding that they're like, this will be okay, even though it seems bad. Let's talk about what we do next and that kind of stuff. Like having that level of anticipation and a level of understanding and empathy for the team can be very hard, especially when things are going a little sideways or you've had a sudden change, because you're processing it yourself, right? You're dealing with it and you're trying to get the level of fortitude. So, it all comes, I think, through a lot of time and experience and just being willing to say, yeah, this is terrible, but it's okay. Let's talk about what we'll do next. And that for me was the methodology that got me through any kind of weird stuff like that. Yeah.
I mean, leaving a place like BioWare, it's a good opportunity, I think, just to brainstorm and think, what if a studio, the scale of a BioWare, just stopped conveyor belts of production and just said, what is the most efficient way to deliver something satisfying to our fans? Do you think about that, of like, what groove are we in that it's tough to get out of? I think we do this at Game Informer. Maybe we should do it more, but just that idea of like, we've just been on this conveyor belt for so long, but if we just had to stop everything, is there a better means of going about it? I'm curious what you think about a studio the scale of BioWare. Like, is it just, okay, what if we separated into 5 teams and just made smaller RPGs, less scope, and just crank that out? Like, do you ever just brainstorm like that?
Yeah, I think there's a real value to asking yourself questions that almost sound silly at the beginning. Like, what would a 3-hour RPG look like?
Totally.
A satisfying RPG experience that basically got rid of all the, no grinding, no nothing. So it's still choices and it's still got stats. But how does that work? And I don't have an answer for that one.
I think the answer is Undertale, by the way.
Pardon me?
I think the answer is Undertale.
Yeah, actually, that's very true. I'm filled with determination. I ultimately, I think that asking those questions are incredibly valuable, and I think you do need to pause. And I think for us, we would use between projects because, again, when you had sort of Group A ramping up, and then Group B would tend to go small and go back to like a nucleus, and those were the times when you could make changes. And that doesn't tend to like revolutionize a studio, but it does have incremental gains. We saw an entire methodology for evaluating like player content by player experience, which is to say it was like the writing, the levels, the everything like that, sort of like Valve's orange box methodology where they would like take things to a certain point. We developed a whole a flow for that over the course of the Mass Effects, which Dragon Age then adopted because it was proven to be very successful. We had some excellent feedback from the team, and we said, great, why don't we kind of do that same kind of lockstep phase gating with approvals process that they're doing, and we adopted it and brought it into our own. So it wasn't, again, a revolution, but it was an evolution of that kind of, production maturity that was very, very cool. So you do tend to see that on a smaller scale where each studio kind of, as the team ramps down, they have a moment to be introspective. And we were pretty aggressive about postmortems and getting the team together and, letting people sometimes vent, but also like, but what would you do to fix it is a very important question because often the team has incredible insight.
Yeah. It's such a weird time too, just thinking about each release is going to be realistically spaced out further and further apart. Mass Effect Andromeda took a long time. Dragon Age Inquisition took a long time, although I think the first Dragon Age took a long time as well. But I mean, what do you do to combat that? Do you just say, hey, fans, sit tight for 5 years. We'll be back in a bit?
Well, I mean, it works for Bethesda.
It's true.
I think, especially in the RPG space, people are more than happy to wait if they feel that the quality of the product is directly impacted by a delay. And I have increasingly moved to the belief that as an industry, we are no longer really competing for money. I think we're competing for time.
Totally.
Right? There are so many games. There's almost let's call it a critical mass of games that are currently people's constant rotation. And so now if you release like a big AAA, especially if it's not like an extended, actually it doesn't matter. If you release any game, you are now asking people not only to buy your game, but to make the conscious decision to stop playing their regular, whether it's League or Overwatch or PUBG or whatever, any of those games. You're basically saying, hey, can we shoulder our way into your day? Because I my kind of like go-to kind of filler game right now is Final Fantasy 14 because they have a very compelling progression loop. They let you level up every class, so there's always something I can do in Final Fantasy 14. I'll run Ravenaster this week and then should do my dailies and all that stuff. For other people, it's PUBG or their League scores or they're working on Overwatch because there's loot boxes in this week's event.
Yeah.
You name it. You're asking people to say, hey, put that on pause or prioritize us for a little while ahead of that, or potentially move something aside to make room for our new game, which again, sometimes you get a PUBG and that happens. So the money obviously matters, but building something of quality and of, I don't know, I think of it as like there's a word of mouth component where people are like, no, you need to play Witcher 3. Everybody needs to play Witcher 3. That causes that kind of exponential jump and growth. And I don't think you get that unless you're carefully considered and you're building something of quality.
Yeah. Can you wrap your mind around somebody like, is it Larian Studios? I mean, Divinity Original Sin and 2 just last year, which, has had a huge amount of success. Do you look at that and it's just like, how the hell are those guys able to crank that out? Or what are your thoughts on that production?
Well, okay, so I look at Divinity and, I've always believed that like a true sequel, like this is a similar engine. These are relatively well-known tool sets. These are relatively well-known rules. We have a setting, like all of that stuff. True sequels, as opposed to like, this isn't me bitching, but like Inquisition was like a jump to a new engine, right? So it's not a sequel in the same way. That there's a force multiplier in having a veteran team who knows the world, they know the stuff, they know how to build it, and they know what they're doing. And now they get to kind of run a little more wild with their ideas, or they know how to generate content very quickly. So I look at Original Sin 2 as being an absolutely brilliant move on their part. They had a massive tech investment to make the turn-based combat, the verticality, the interactions between the elements, lighting blood on fire is amazing. I'm going to explode that acid, all that stuff, right? Like they took that, they doubled down on it, they smoothed out some of the tougher kind of challenges. And then they were like, let's go really hardcore into multiplayer. Let's add in the tool set. Like they made additive and incremental improvements along the lines of, I guess, their core audience. And I think what happens when you do that is that if you had initial success, which Original Sin 1 absolutely did, that all the people who had been saying to their friends, hey man, you need to play Original Sin, you need to play Original Sin. Often their friends don't listen to that. But when the second one comes out and then your buddy's like, no, the sequel's even better, it's like, okay, fine, right? There's kind of this mind share that the public goes into that, I think Witcher 3 did the exact same thing where everyone was like, Witcher 2 is really good, Witcher 2 is really good. And then 3 comes out and now you're like, I'm not behind the curve. I can jump in. They're telling me it's friendly. Holy shit, that looks pretty. You name it. And suddenly I think that's where your sequel explosion comes from. And I think I don't know the exact sales numbers, but I feel like, that's a 1.5 times whatever you sold of the one before.
Yeah,
right?
definitely. Now, if you listen carefully, Mike, you can hear thousands of people listening or watching this screaming, Dragon Age 2, explain it. Why is that a different scenario?
So Dragon Age 2 was an exceptionally aggressive production cycle. There's no other way to describe it. We followed up a 6-year-long dev cycle with a 16-month-ish dev cycle.
Yeah.
That's very hard. That's an exceptionally hard thing to do. And frankly, I absolutely recognize that there are problems with Dragon Age 2. There are parts of the game that are weak, that are significantly weaker than Origins. People get very angry if I don't preface things with that. He just thinks it's great. No,
right.
I am well aware Templars just falling in from the sky is not ideal. It's Raining Men videos aside, because they are funny, but essentially it was an exceptionally challenging switchover. There was a change to the art style. And you put all that together and you end up with a scenario where we had to tell an exceptionally different kind of story. We had to reuse a lot more assets. We had to make some very, very hard choices to make that happen. That was not me giving the direction that we'll do this in 16 months, but it was essentially a need of the studio that I cannot really discuss.
Yeah.
And we did it. And the fact that we pulled that off at the level we did, I think is pretty spectacular. But that doesn't mean that it is immune from criticism.
So it wasn't a late game crumple. It was, hey, from the starting gate, this is what we have to do. Let's do it.
We opened by driving the car into the wall and then said, okay, what do we do with this crash test dummy? But no, there were a lot of things like the decision to say, let's set it in kind of one location, but we'll move it forward across time, for instance, was me desperately looking for a game that had pulled that kind of thing off. And there were two paths that I could see that were possible. One was the Majora's Mask, like we're going to create a looping story, but that felt Dragon Age was lower magic than that, so we felt that wasn't appropriate. So the other inspiration for that was going to Eternal Darkness, the GameCube game, if you remember it, where Eternal Darkness regularly reused locations, but they did so through different times. So you were in like the Mayan, I think it was Mayan or was it Aztec? One of them. Anyway, temple. And you were the priestess and it was all lit up and it was clean and gold. And then later you were the archaeologist and it was, cobweb filled and dark and, spooky, but it was the same geometry, the same textures, but a different lighting, different treatment and so on. They did that many, many times. They used the church multiple times. They used the mansion, all kinds of different ways for retraversal, little Metroidvania. And in doing so, I thought that they'd done a very good job using what I saw as a limited palette of assets. And I said, that might be a way forward. Yeah. What if we told a story that took place over time? And again, it was something new that fantasy hadn't really done in the gaming space, where time would jump forward and you'd see characters evolve. And like usual, the Dragon Age team always over-delivers in terms of their character evolutions and the characterization. And, some of our gameplay stuff suffered, right? And it wasn't, I don't think it was atrocious, but it definitely was not the best possible follow-up we could have done to Origins. Right. And I recognize that. But, I will never not be proud of the work Luke and Cheryl, two of our writers, did with Aveline and Isabella and how their relationship evolved over those 3 time periods. It was just exceptional, right? And Varric and the Hawk family and its remarkable tragedy and you name it.
Yeah, a lot of great stuff in there.
Yeah.
Do you feel the pressure to keep up with all RPGs because people just see you as, oh, you're the RPG guy. Surely you've played everything that's ever been released.
I mean, there's a pressure. I'm not sure I succeed at keeping up with that pressure. I've been, playing through Divinity, finally getting into the Witcher DLCs. But yeah, they are, the thing with RPGs is trying to keep up with all of them is that it's borderline impossible just due to the volume of time needed. But they are there are some absolutely stellar games out there right now. And it's interesting as well because when living in my indie space, it's interesting to find stuff that's more like your indie RPGs. The one I've been geeking out on is done by two brothers, the Treese brothers, I think they're called, and they made a game called Star Traders Frontiers, and it's maybe 500 meg. It is top down, or no, done. It's not. It's kind of a top down space sim, like if Elite Dangerous had remarkably detailed politics with like trade alliances and factions, and you could gain like bounty hunting marks and trade permits and ranks with factions across 12 different navies, evolving storylines and eras. Occasionally you pull into port and there's like terrorists, and it's up to you to decide if you want to like leap to the defense of the port, help the terrorists, and that again determines your factions or reputations.
Oh, wow.
And I'm playing this badass trader right now with a crew of like 36 people, all of whom I'm named and customized, and they all have their own skill sets. It's deep. It's a titch impenetrable, but they are making the UI better, and they patch the thing every 4 days. And that's very much like a space sim RPG, almost like Privateer. And like, okay, that's out there, and it's astonishing, and I love it. And I'm going to keep playing it because it's baller. But you need to try. It's this interesting mix for me where I need to play the AAAs. I need to get the RPG adjacent stuff, right? Like Horizon, right? And you could say Assassin's Creed Origins. Need to get to those and get through those. I played a big chunk of Horizon, but not Assassin's Creed at all. Like, it's overwhelming. So you have to kind of pick your battles. Often if someone pings me about contracting and there's something kind of like more, if they're like, we're more in action adventure, then I would start digging into those. And even in the course of a week, you can get a really good sense of what the game is like. You may not know the spoilers for the story endings, but you can get a good sense of like, okay, what does Horizon let me do? What can I do in Origins? How are they building into stats and that kind of stuff? So you can learn stuff pretty quickly.
Yeah. Well, hey, like removing BioWare from the equation to make it easier for you. What do you think is like the best RPG of the last 10 years? Is there one that stands out?
Best RPG of the past 10 years. Whew, that's tough. Let me go back. I'm going to come down and just say that. Oh man, that's tough. You know what? I'm going to say Skyrim. And I'll tell you why I'm going to say Skyrim.
Yeah.
So, I mean, obvious contenders, Witcher, huge, right? Obviously, I think the Divinities are stellar. Like they are amazing games, but they're like the old school. But I think for me, when I look at Skyrim, it was, I think it achieved on 2 to 3. I don't know. We'll see. Any number of different vectors. So the first thing it did is it took a world like Morrowind was weird and amazing, and then Oblivion was very generic but more approachable, right? It had a smoother UI. It was a lot easier to dive into, but it was also a little bit forgettable. Like, and Lord love me, I love that game, but it was, welcome to our stone castles and gates of demons, right? Yes. Like, okay, that's cool. But with Skyrim, what they did is they said, okay, cool, all of that, but what if you were a badass dragon killing Viking? And you're like, okay, that's a fantasy that I can latch onto, and that gives me more impulse and more presence in the world as a character. You're like, okay, cool, I am the Dragonborn. That's way more significant than I'm helping Martin, right? So I think that it I wouldn't say, it's not like a narrative triumph in that it like blew my mind or anything, but it definitely took a formula and took it to a next level. The fact that they support and continue to support modding tools, and that the players are able to put it through the point where it's like, here's the latest best Skyrim patches is still being put out, right? Totally. Is astonishing. And the breadth and depth of activities, the fact that they thunk you down in the very middle of a giant map, and that, there are whole parts of that game I still haven't seen 130 hours in, right, is to me astonishing. Yeah. So I think it's just like when we're looking on the horizon of 10 years, I think that it, in a lot of ways, refined open world, set a new bar that I think Witcher, was able to follow through, and then went much more narratively heavy with that fixed character. But it also, they did a level of mod support, a level of community support, and a level of passion that I think not many games have ever achieved. But again, I consider it to be slightly first in a very, very tight heat.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned Witcher. I mean, have you had much interaction with CD Projekt Red? Do you ever reach out to those guys?
On and off. Like it's not like we're grabbing coffee because Poland's a long way away. But when I see them at cons and stuff, I'm like, hey, loved your game. It was absolutely fantastic. And they reply with the same thing. And I mean, CD Projekt Red like licensed the Aurora engine, which was the Neverwinter Nights engine, to do Witcher 1. Right? A lot of people forget that. They're like, well, you guys must hate each other because fantasy. And it's like, no, man. No, I get to play that game and I don't know how it turns out. That sounds awesome. I think, and you look at it and you're like, well, those games are competing, and a lot of people are like, oh, well, Witcher's far better and everything's amazing. I'm like, sure, unless you want a party, right? Unless you want like a lot of the things that made Dragon Age really stand out and unique, I think, were things that Witcher didn't particularly dig into. They had notable characters, but they didn't do that party experience or the banter, all that stuff. So they make very different games. And we had to lean more into like tabula rasa characters, like you could be a Canary or an elf or a male or a female. Like all these characters are different. Whereas they had the advantages and disadvantages of you get to be Geralt and kind of like dig into his history and his relationships and so on. So like I love that it is a different game, but it's also like there's elements of it that are similar, elements that are different. And I think that's just to, frankly, the industry's benefit. Like if we all made the same game, it would kind of suck. I think we need a Divinity. We need a Witcher. We need a Skyrim. Like we need all of those because, again, we're fighting for time. People don't have time to play it all. So let's give them a breadth of experience and see what resonates with each segment of the audience.
Yeah, definitely. So CD Projekt Red just called tomorrow and offered you a job on Cyberpunk. You wouldn't take it. Is that right? You're hell bent on consulting for a while.
Okay, so I'm really digging the consulting, but if there's a few things that would certainly they would raise an eyebrow. They would absolutely raise an eyebrow. There was okay, so I am a giant cyberpunk nerd. Like straight up Neuromancer is my favorite novel of all time.
Oh wow,
straight
okay.
Up. Yeah, like I am. William Gibson could like write on the stall of a bathroom, and I would make a small pilgrimage there. Like he is a brilliant author, and like the idea of kind of the Case and Molly kind of heist thing is just that was seared in 12-year-old me's mind, and Cyberpunk would certainly pull me in. Right, I'm watching Altered Carbon. I'm looking forward to Mute. That's another one in that space. So Netflix seems to be leaning there as well. But for the most part. Like, moving to Poland and moving my family and that kind of stuff would all be exceptionally challenging. But it's still like Cyberpunk's always had a draw. It's always had a draw. And I think, again, it's interesting that they're going to like that particular Cyberpunk is like an R. Telsorian. Like it wasn't even an A-lister kind of like pen and paper, but it was a very cohesive world that was very it was very well thought up, if not like it didn't have like the kind of hook in the same way Shadowrun did, but it did have its own corporations, it had its own stuff. And I think it was very true to that Gibson-esque kind of style where it was like, yeah, no, this is pretty much corporate dystopia. Enjoy. So yeah, I'm wildly looking forward to seeing what they come up with at E3. Let me tell you.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Well, I mean, we can wrap up here. I'm just curious. You have more insight into the inner workings of BioWare than most people on planet Earth, I'd say.
Sure.
Are there comments that drive you insane? Do you read? I mean, just absorbing the internet. I think there are, obviously, you've seen fans out there. The FEA crowd is loud and dominant. And there's also some fans who are like, I'm a little bit worried about Anthem now. A little bit worried about Anthem. Do you have a message for those fans or anything you'd like to communicate to people that are in that camp?
I don't know. I mean, Anthem's its own beast, but I think that the team on it are exceptionally talented, and a number of the people that were working with me are over there helping out as well. Like and I've talked to folks who've played it in the studio, and they're like, no, man, it's getting like sincerely fun and very cool. So I'm very hopeful for it, and I think that. If BioWare ends up in a space where they do crack the biggest chestnut, which will be getting kind of their more reactive storytelling style into something that's a bit more cooperative, I think that's going to be awesome, right? And again, you look at Divinity Original Sin 2, which I think like 1 had it, but I think 2 really leaned hard into the co-op storytelling, and there was some exceptional work there. So I would not say it's impossible by any stretch of the imagination. So in terms of like, should people be worried? I think it's a game, and it's something you should always, dig into and look for. But personally, I'm not sitting here going, oh man, I think, Mark has moved over and has taken over the helm, and I would follow that man into the sun. So that's always a good sign. And in terms of like things that drive me crazy, it's not about Anthem. It's usually, so, if you'd asked me after DA2, I probably would have just started crying because, there were a lot of more personal attacks. And I think, certainly those suck. Yeah. No one person is ever responsible for all decisions. But I think the ones that drive me a little bit crazy are devs are lazy. This is just clearly clearly they're too lazy to do this. And
Right.
it's like, oh man, I have never met a game developer who stayed in the industry for any length of time who was lazy. They were under considerable duress. They were challenged. They worked against impossible odds with often recalcitrant technology. But lazy is the exact opposite. 9 times out of 10, if something comes out, the dev team knows it isn't good way before and feels it way more deeply than anyone critiquing it. And if it does catch you offside, again, any dev I know worth their salt will go, well, let's not make that mistake again. We clearly need a new metric or a new way of evaluating whether this stuff is going to be emotionally satisfying or, whatever the problem was, right? You always inspect and adapt. Like I had members of our production team go through Inquisition and competition reviews and detail like where they were landing and what was being brought up across like 47 different categories in order to get a general sense of not just where the game was landing, but also where the industry was prioritizing their focus and stuff. Like to what degree does choice and consequence come up? And like it tracked enormously powerfully across everything we looked at, right? So it was something that we're like, good, we need to make sure that our internal metrics are also paying attention to that. So,
Right.
Anyway, devs, not lazy, usually incredibly hardworking and probably a little stressed.
Yeah.
So take it easy on them. They're all good people.
That's a good message. Good message. Well, hey, Mike, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Looking forward to the GDC talk. So if you're going to GDC, definitely swing by, check it out. And I don't know, bring signs that spell out Laidlaw or something and hold it up in the crowd. I don't know what you really want. I don't know what your best case scenario for giving a GDC speech is.
I think stunned silence with one person wiping away a tear at the end would be my ideal.
Thank you so much for watching this excerpt from the Game Informer Show podcast. You can subscribe to the audio version and listen to new episodes airing every Thursday. We cover big games on the horizon, games that we've just reviewed. We have long-form developer interviews, a lot of fun stuff. So check it out every Thursday.